All right, we're going to get started. Just so everyone knows, today we were going to have a hearing only on this legislation. Allow everyone to have their say today, and then we'll come back and take back up the measure probably next Tuesday. But I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to come before us today and talk about your concerns or your support of the legislation. I'm going to start off. Once I get this sheet, we'll look at designating how much you will have, or how much time you will have before the committee. But I'm going to start off by recognizing Chairwoman Sheldon to present the legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I bring before the committee Senate Bill 373, and as you said, you have a committee substitute, and there will definitely be I have some changes that I'd like to make for that, but we can do that at a later date. But Senate Bill 373 basically addresses one of the challenges we have in the state. I was really kind of surprised when I found out that currently in the state of Georgia there are only 8 wheelchair accessible taxis in the entire state. 8. 6 of those are in Metro Atlanta, and 2 are in Savannah. And so basically this goal allows for vehicles that pick up passengers outside of their jurisdiction, where they're licensed, to be able to drop off a passenger. Let's just say you've got a passenger that's in Forsyth County, and he's in a wheelchair accessible cab, and they drive into the city of Atlanta, and they would be able to cross jurisdiction, deliver the passenger into Atlanta, and then return from Atlanta with a non-handicapped passenger. So that's just basically kind of some of the things that the bill does. Right now, it really kind of disincentivizes. The current law doesn't allow this, thus disincentivizing the purchase of vehicles, in excess of $45,000 with ramps to handle the wheelchairs. It defines a wheelchair accessible, and also in the committee substitute, there's a sunset to 2017, but we're going to back that down to 2014. I wasn't aware, there are many things I was not aware about with cab owners, but apparently it's definitely a very regulated industry. And in Section 2, you'll see that it requires the cab owners or operators to notify the city or county where they're regulated that they have a vehicle for hire that is wheelchair accessible. That would be on page 2. And also, subsection 3 would allows pickup of passengers after dropping passengers off who originated a trip in another jurisdiction. And subsection 4 requires a distinctive decal on the vehicles to ensure that so citizens know that these vehicles are handicap accessible or wheelchair accessible. Subsection 5 provides sanctions for cabs that are violating these policies, the conditions set forth in this bill. And subsection 6 increases the fine, and then so like in subsection 8, there's a sunset. A couple of changes that I will go ahead and say that I'd like to make in basically the main one is the sunset from 2017 to 2014. I think 2014 would be enough of a time, a couple of years for us to put this in place to see how it operates, to determine if we need to make any changes to legislation.
Okay, I'm going to ask the members, if you will, you have in your folder, you should have the sub. Donna has brought LC 390215S. The original, you should have, you have the original bill as it passed the Senate in there as well. But I'm going to ask, if y'all will, to hold your questions till we hear from the other, if you don't mind, and then we'll come back and ask the author some questions. I'm going to limit everyone to no more than 5 minutes. of discussion, and we'll start off. If anybody else has come in after the fact, we have a sign-up sheet that I have up here. We'll put another one back down here if you wish to speak on behalf or against the legislation. We'll start with what we currently have. Mr. John Keys, if you will, you can come up, and you can either stand at the podium or sit at the table, whichever one you would like to do. Okay. Please state when you come up who you're with and if you're for or against the legislation. Mr. Keys.
I'm John Keys. I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Georgia Council on Developmental Disabilities and the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia. And I've been working with those two organizations for about a year and a half, dealing with Transportation Investment Act issues, trying to get the disability community in front of decision makers so we can get some projects to advance the transportation needs of the disability community. And one of the issues that came to our attention pretty quickly, to my attention for sure, is the jurisdictional limitations excuse me, on getting wheelchair accessible taxi cabs to cross jurisdictional boundaries and pick up a passenger and make a return trip to the home jurisdiction. That becomes pretty much of an economic issue for taxi cab owners when it actually disincentivizes investing in, as Representative Sheldon said, we've only got 8 wheelchair accessible taxis in the entire state of Georgia, serving 10 million population. We don't know how many are needed, but we do know that probably a little more than 8 are definitely needed. So what we tried to do with this bill was put an incentive for taxi cab companies to invest in these vehicles, wheelchair accessible vehicles, which are defined in subsection 7 on the 3rd page of the bill. Oh,
now, are you working off the sub, or are you working off the original bill?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the substitute. Sorry, it's on line 90. It defines what is a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and what it would do would be it spells out the conditions, as Representative Sheldon said, on the conditions under which passengers can be picked up in a wheelchair accessible vehicle, taken outside of that licensing jurisdiction, and pick up a passenger to bring back. In other words, get a paying fare to come back to the host jurisdiction. And that's simply stated what the bill does. I'd be happy to answer any questions, though, if you have any.
Any members have any questions for Mr. Keys? Mr. Key, Representative?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Chairman Dollar, that's you, or who's 16? Representative Bryan, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a background in this area, and I admit that as far as tax is concerned, the numbers are right, and it's probably not enough to cover the state. But what happens with non-emergency medical people that has these wheelchair vans?
Good question, sir. Most of the state, all of the state, is covered by the Department of Human Services. Georgia DOT has rural transportation services as well, and the Department of Community Health has a brokerage system for non-emergency medical transportation. What this bill would do would be put another option out there for transportation for individuals using wheelchairs. It would be in addition to what's already in place.
I think it's a great idea.
Good question. Thank you, sir.
I think it's good.
Chairman Dollar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not as familiar with the jurisdictional component of this. Explain that, how that operates.
Okay. Existing law is what's in the bill, the first 2 subsections. It talks about medallions and certificates of public necessity. One jurisdiction has them. That's what you have to have a certificate of public to operate a taxi cab in Atlanta. The other jurisdictions in the state that do license taxi cabs or regulate them operate under the general regulatory power of local government. So what we tried to do was be very careful in the drafting of the bill to not mess with the local authority of regulation of taxi cabs, but still allow those kinds of cabs to pick up passengers after they deliver. Current law says that you can pick up a passenger in your licensing jurisdiction, City of Atlanta, which is the only jurisdiction that has wheelchair accessible vehicles besides Savannah. You can drop off a passenger in Cobb, Paulding, anywhere outside of City of Atlanta, Sandy Springs. But you can't pick up a passenger for the return trip back to Atlanta. So that's what this bill would do, allows for that to happen under very circumscribed conditions. Did I answer? I hope I answered.
Yeah, I've got a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. What are the what kind of costs are we talking about in fitting a taxi cab or a van with this kind of equipment?
Yes, sir. A new wheelchair accessible taxi is about $45,000. So that's a heck of an investment. And then if you add clean fuel component to it, it adds another $1,000 or $2,000. So it's a heavy investment.
And does it? Again, I'm very new to this. Can only vans, or what kind of vehicles are able to be retrofitted here?
Well, and I guess it would allow for retrofitting, but we're thinking more in terms of the industry itself is really coming along significantly. So there are a lot of manufacturers now who are actually producing for that very purpose wheelchair accessible vehicles.
Okay.
So the cost is, like I said, 45 up to about 45. Add 2,000 for clean fuel component. Retrofits are also there, but again, we only have eight in the state right now. 6 here, 2 in Savannah.
Okay.
Who's 24? Chairman Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not real familiar with this situation either. So, do we have difference in licensing for the City of Atlanta than Fulton County or DeKalb County? I mean, how does the licensing statewide, or I guess if we're trying to help with the wheelchair accessibility, would it be better for just a state to license them? That way, they would have full reign statewide rather than jurisdictional licensing?
We talked about that in the drafting of the legislation. We wanted to keep it at the local level so that we wouldn't have significant, we hoped significant opposition from local governments, which would fear some sort of state intrusion in their local home rule powers. So that's why we drafted it that way. But to answer to the two parts of your question, the other part would be the licensing requirements vary. They do in terms of dollars. It's a regulatory function. It's supposed to be tied to the cost of regulation of the taxi industry and the fee that's charged, but they do vary across the board. So that's why we're trying to just say that you can operate under circumstances spelled out. We got markings for enforcement by the local jurisdictions that are licensing right now and regulating taxis. So we're trying to do everything we can to accommodate local governments and the taxi industry while trying to incentivize getting more of these vehicles on the streets.
Well, can I follow up with that, Mr. Chairman? So I'm just trying to understand, what we're looking at here.
Yes, sir.
So, in your example, City of Atlanta person picks up in downtown here on Peachtree Street, and it takes them down to Shannon Mall or something in South Fulton County that's outside the city limits. Shannon Mall, it doesn't have a taxi cab license. It shouldn't matter. But if they do have taxi cab licensing there, they're not allowed to pick up. Otherwise, they're losing revenue for that area.
That area. They can do, is that I got your question.
I don't know that if I even, isn't it not true? I don't know if I stated that as a question or not, but that was my favorite Penny Houston impersonation. Isn't it not true?
Double negative on top of it.
I love Chairman Houston.
To answer, I hope I answer your question. If a cab drops now, if it's the same customer who is taken to Shannon Mall, which South Fulton or Clayton, I'm sorry.
I think it's South Fulton.
Different jurisdiction. Fulton does regulate taxis. Fulton County regulates taxis as well as the City of Atlanta and a host of other jurisdictions as well. The passenger, if the passenger wanted to keep the cab there and make the return trip, that counts as one trip. So it's okay. But the meter's running, or they negotiate a fare, whatever. I don't know how it's done. Anyway, but so that would be one trip. It's okay to use the same cab. If, however, the person is dropped off at Shannon Mall and has to call another cab, they're pretty much on their own, unless there's an accessible cab that's able to accommodate their needs in that jurisdiction. And I'll let Ms. Puckett and Mr. Neighbors handle that question as well, if I can.
I think there's.
I think that's somewhat answered. But basically, if not, then you would be violating their jurisdictional regulatory oversight by allowing a cab to pick someone up in there.
That's my understanding, and talking with the cab industry as well.
All right, thank you.
I could stand corrected on that.
27, is that
testifying.
you, Chairman Ryan, Representative Harrell?
Mr. Keyes, and I think I've got this clear now, but this legislation will apply only to wheelchair accessible vehicles, and the additional incentive is the ability for this provider, once he leaves his origination point where he's licensed, to make that return trip. That's the additional incentive. They've got this investment in this vehicle, and once they get out of their jurisdiction, now they've got a no-fare trip back if it happens to be. So the additional incentive is that return trip. It only applies to the wheelchair accessible vehicles. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Chairman Dollar.
You were just talking about the local jurisdictions. I was just wondering, have you had any discussions with Municipal Association, ACCG, and where is that conversation gone?
I think we're going to get to hear from them.
Okay, all right.
I'll let them speak for themselves.
Chairman Reinders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your dedication to people with developmental disabilities. I'm a huge fan of that work. I was approached earlier on the benefit to rural Georgia, and there's a supply and demand issue in my mind that I'm trying to work my way through. Let's suppose for the moment that there's a dialysis clinic, and I believe there is, in Dawson, Georgia. But Dawson, Georgia, in Terrell County, doesn't have a taxi cab company. I would assume that they don't have a taxi cab company because there's just not enough benefit to provide taxi service, or else somebody would have probably already entered to that market. So if the cab company from Albany gets a call and takes someone to the dialysis clinic in Dawson because they're handicap accessible, there's a part of me that says the very purpose, which is to provide them the incentive for the round trip, is how do they make that trip if they don't have somebody in Dawson waiting to come back?
Right. And does Dawson, excuse me, sorry, is that the question?
Yes, sir.
Does Dawson County, it's Dawson County.
No, sir, it's Terrell County.
I'm sorry, Terrell County. Does Terrell County currently license taxi cabs?
Well, I'm using this hypothetical, and no.
Okay. The
benefit is that you're able to pick up another passenger.
Right.
My question would be, obviously, well, if there's not enough business in Terrell County to support a cab company, I can't help but wonder when they drop that person off in a wheelchair that there's not a fare ready to come back 35 miles to Albany. And what you've in fact done was created the unintended consequences of having an unpaid fare.
I think that would probably be in that circumstance, it would probably be a negotiation on the fare of the individual boarding in Albany, Dougherty County, to go to Terrell County, a negotiated fare. But there also is available the brokers under the Department of Community Health, and if the passenger is a wheelchair user who is using it for a non-emergency medical transportation trip, then they would get a trip provided through that department and that broker.
Mr. Chairman, may I continue down this line of logic? When I'm in the taxi in Atlanta, is it not true that I get charged for the traffic because they're not being able to pick up more fares? You know, the wait time sometimes, doesn't that happen?
The wait time for a cab?
No, you're stuck in traffic sometimes in Atlanta. They're running the meter on you, even though you haven't moved, because there's only so many hours in a day, and there's so many, and I can only run so many fares.
Yeah.
And again, that same logic applies that if I've got to go in this hypothetical to Dawson, Georgia, and I've got no one in return, how long do I wait to do it, or am I not basically traveling 70 miles for one fare?
I don't know that I can answer that one, Mr. Reinders.
All right, thank you. And if I may, on another point, what if Terrell County in that same situation then all of a sudden said, you know what I want to do? I want to pass to the Association of County Commissioners or my county commission, I want to pass an ordinance that says anybody that comes in here from another jurisdiction, I can now charge them X amount of dollars to be able to run a taxi cab service from an outlying area. Is there anything that would prohibit that?
Mr. Reinders, I'm not sure I can answer that question. That's one that's way above my pay grade.
All right, and finally,
knowledge.
and I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it, finally, in the area on page 3 that says on line 88, if such an operator is found guilty of the offense, and let me, before I go there, because this goes into it about what the previous question, what would prohibit another jurisdiction from all of a sudden potentially creating a hurdle to providing that service in that particular county? Could they not make the fine or the hurdle so high that it almost prohibits it, which would again undermine the purpose? Couldn't the county do that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that the provisions of state law would govern in that instance.
Okay.
So this is what you see is what you get on the
All right,
fines.
and finally on line 88, Mr. Chairman, if I may continue one more. Yes. The guilty of the offense at a hearing held in the jurisdiction where the offenses were alleged to have occurred. Would that occur in Terrell County where they don't have any ordinances if a violation occurred there? And who would hold that hearing?
The hearing would be if the offending, quote-unquote, offending cab was from Daugherty County, it would be in Daugherty County, the home jurisdiction of that taxi cab.
Okay, and where's that hearing held? Is that like a court case of what you're talking about?
Usually, I would think, take the form of an administrative hearing.
Okay.
By the city, by the where license, or the county.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, one more, I'm sorry. Why wouldn't it be just as easy to require big cab companies to just say, and X amount % has to be handicap accessible? 3
jurisdictions are currently in litigation right now. New York City, Philadelphia is very close, and Washington is real close. This is an attempt to not have to do that approach. It's a very harsh remedy on the taxi industry. They're very expensive vehicles. Like I said, $45,000, $48,000 if you put clean fuel into it. This is a milder incentive, but it's an incentive nonetheless, and it tries to avoid taking that approach.
I'm just wondering if it doesn't relieve the pressure from the outside jurisdiction that doesn't have any that may enact local legislation or local laws to prohibit something or put them in a situation where they don't have a return fare. I was just thinking outside the box as a potential solution, but thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Last question, Representative Bryant.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I operate a similar service currently, and I live in Garden City, Georgia. I'm licensed in Garden City. However, in order to operate in the city of Savannah, I have to operate under their guidance. In fact, my vehicles have to be inspected by the city of Savannah and given a decal, and I pay them $80 per vehicle. They also have, I guess you call them inspectors, that travels the city, and when one of us are not in compliance, they can pull us over just like a police officer. And if there's a charge, we have to go to Savannah City Court, just like any other thing. So they govern that, whether you licensed in their city or not. If you operate in the city of Savannah, you have to play by the city of Savannah rules. I agree with the expense of a wheelchair van. I converted a wheelchair van some years ago, $10,000 what it cost me just to convert it after paying $30 plus for the van. It's expensive, and the taxi service right now currently in Savannah, I don't know if it's profitable. They do have the 2 taxis, but they're not making a lot of money right now because of non-emergency medical, handling most of the dialysis type of patients and stuff like that. And the company that operates that pay round trip. It's not that much. I got out the business because it wasn't profitable. However, they do pay you round trip. Not a taxi. I'm talking regular service. I think it's a good thing. I think the taxes are needed, but I think it's going to take a special person to finance taxes and to do it, to make some money.
Thank you, Mr. Keys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
And excuse me if I get this wrong. Pat, is it Noby? Noby? Noby?
Oh, he mispronounced my last name.
But you were close.
He works for Pat Puckett and Pat Noby wrote the wrong name.
Okay, so you're,
Pat Puckett.
okay, Miss Pat.
That's who's supposed to be here.
Okay. Is that green light on?
Red?
You need green.
Does it take a time to warm up?
Okay. If it's on red, okay, go ahead.
Okay,
Speak.
so you hear me now? Okay. My name is Pat Puckett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Independent Living Council. And the role of the Independent Living Council is to try to create a more accessible world for people with disabilities. And there's one of me in every state in the union. And last January, we did our national gathering of Independent Living Council directors and board chairs here in Atlanta. And I have to tell you, I got an incredible amount of grief from my colleagues across the country because at the time, there were 2 operable wheelchair accessible taxis. Even though now we have 6, at the time we only had 2 because it was a year and some odd months ago. And those old taxi cabs, as you know, go down a whole lot. So I started looking into how is it that some cities have sizable fleets. Why is that? And for example, Houston, Texas has about 200 of them. And so I got sort of a snapshot of taxis across the country, or taxi cab availability across the country. And it's not so hot here in Atlanta, as you might guess. So guess where our national meeting was this January, January of 2012? Houston, Texas, because they have 200 accessible taxis and we have 4, 6, whatever, in the city of Atlanta. One of the things I guess I'd like to say to you is that if you can, I know it's tough to separate the Medicaid-funded non-emergency transportation from accessible taxis, but they really are separate. When I take a taxi cab, I pay for it. When a person goes to dialysis, typically the Medicaid agency pays for it, or their private insurance pays for it. So it's a third-party billing situation, and let me tell you, it's way more higher, that's redundant, way higher than what you pay for a taxi cab. And so there is a growing population of people with disabilities like me who make a decent living, and like Bill, who would like to be able to get from point A to point B easily. If we can do it in Vegas, if we can do it in Chicago, if we can do it in Houston, why can't we do it in Atlanta? And one of the reasons that we have a big problem as to why we cannot do it in Atlanta is all of these jurisdictional fights. You know, the home turf for every little place that needs to give you a medallion or a license or whatever. So we're simply trying to remove one barrier, and that is allowing a taxi driver to pick up a person outside of their jurisdiction so they don't have an unfared, or what's known as in the business as a deadhead trip, back to their jurisdiction. We've put penalties in place to allow for cheaters because there's this horrible fear that there's going to be this huge fleet of accessible taxis running around pirating fares from different cities. It ain't happening. If you have to pay $50,000 for a vehicle, you're not going to be running around the entire Atlanta region trying to pirate trips everywhere. It's just not going to happen. But we put penalties in there anyway, and we put a sunset provision in there anyway. So I guess all I'm asking is, what more could we possibly do to satisfy the cities and counties and to satisfy the taxi industry? We have given and we've given and we've given, and so it's very frustrating that people don't seem to be in support of what is a very simple notion. Business people who use wheelchairs need to be able to get from point A to point B, and we need your help with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pat. Is it Bill Neighbors? Or is that close enough?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Bill Neighbors. I'm an attorney in private practice in Atlanta. I'm here today because I'm a wheelchair user and I have a privilege of traveling a good bit. In every other city I go to, I have no problem, be it Tampa, New York, Chicago, Las Vegas, even Nassau, Bahamas, no problem. I heard that say for the city side of Atlanta, it's hard for those people in business to take trips if you can't get a cab. We have the Medicaid vehicles, but if I have a businessman at 8 o'clock at night in Alpharetta, I have to have a private driver come get me, which for me is fine, but if you were coming out of town, you're just not going to have access to where you need to go. As we discussed today, the measure to allow a return failure is an incentive, but as people have pointed out, it's not perfect, but it's one step in the direction of incentivizing a taxi company to make what is a considerable investment to procure an accessible cab.
Thank you. Any question? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bill. Abby Cox, what do you want to, okay.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Abby Cox with the Georgia Council on Aging. Georgia Council on Aging convenes the Coalition of Advocates for Georgia's Elderly, which is our grassroots advocacy organization. Every year we have individuals coming to us wanting better, more accessible transportation options throughout the state. We believe that this is a step in the right direction. We support more transportation, we support better transportation, and we support this bill.
All right, thank you. Any questions? All right. All right, Mr. Tom Bauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Tom Bauer with the Georgia Transit Association, and we also support this bill. I have not seen the substitute, but I think it's back to where the original bill was in the Senate in concept, and that's one of the reasons that we support the incentive, as Representative Harrell was clearly articulated what that incentive was. Those of you who, of course, the chairman had to just leave, but some of you were on the Regional Transit Governance Task Force, and you know that GTA has testified over the years into that task force as well about the kind of overlap between transit and disabilities and getting people from one place to another. And one of the things that has not been mentioned that we selfishly think would be a good incentive is that transit systems, if you don't provide that incentive for folks to have a return fare, then that puts a little bit more pressure on our paratransit, and transit agencies are prohibited by federal law from charging more than twice the normal fare. So that's another reason that we support this bill. It does seem to be a modest start, as a couple of people have said. Mr. Dollar, I think that was a good question about the cost, but since this isn't a mandate, it's an option, I think, where somebody who owned a cab could decide, yes, this is an investment I want to make. And so I think it would be a good start. And so we, too, are interested, as always, in mobility for riders and would support this bill.
All right, thank you, Mr. Tom. Any questions for him? No? Okay, next we've got Miss Megan Middleton.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for allowing us to speak today. I'm Megan Middleton. I represent the City of Atlanta. While we do understand the intent behind this bill, we do have some concerns. We do have a taxi cab division. Our manager, Cedric Burse, is with me today if there are any detailed questions, but we have a division. It falls within the Atlanta Police Department that handles our taxi cabs and the medallion holders. Currently in the City of Atlanta, it's between $50,000 to $60,000 to get a medallion to have a taxi service in the City of Atlanta. Some of our concerns are in the language with fines and punishments. It doesn't quite read the same way that this is what I've been told by the law department, that other fines and punishments read in the other sections of the state code. Other traffic fines, other criminal fines. It's laid out more that the local governments are given direct authority to enforce those, whereas in this bill, specifically more on line 78, it's not quite laid out that it definitely gives local jurisdictions the authority to impose these fines. And so that could be a question, it could be a challenge that we would have to face in the future if this were to go through as it is written. We have just gotten the substitute about an hour and a half or so ago. We haven't gone back through the review reviewing it, even though I know that it was similar to the original bill, but we're looking at that again. We would like to, and we have requested that we work with the stakeholders going forward, and that's all stakeholders. That's cities, counties, MARTA, centers such as Shepherd Center, hospitals, and of course the community that would be served, to see what other methods or what other ways we can address their needs and to basically make everybody happy going forward. So we do want to continue these conversations. We've Mr. Keys has had us involved. We've been going back and forth a little bit on our concerns, and we do want to move forward on this. Like I said, we do appreciate the intent of this, but we do have some legal concerns to the bill.
You've got a question, Ms. Megan. Chairman Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Middleton, can you explain to me a little bit about the medallion program? Just give me an idea. You say 50,000. Give me an idea of what that really contains and what you get for that, and just understand as a person that's really not familiar with that.
And if I may,
sure,
Representative Hamilton, I'll leave that to Mr. Burse.
Can I ask you a question before you step down, if you don't mind?
Mm-hmm.
On the lines, in reading the bill, I guess one of the questions how are you going to police this outside? I mean, in other words, let's use Cobb County comes in and catches somebody in violation 3 times. They've paid for a $50,000 medallion within the City of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how is that going to affect y'all in the policing, I guess, is the question I'd like to hear from y'all, too.
Okay. My understanding would be the operational, issues of policing someone coming in who does not have one of our medallions?
Well, no, I guess my question is, in other words, if you have a handicap accessible van, they have a medallion for the city of Atlanta, and they've went to Cobb County, and they're not operating like they should, and this Cobb County catches them, it has in the bill the first time it's an offense, second time, third time. At what point, I mean, within this legislation, are we going to say that a person from Cobb County can come in and revoke a $50,000 medallion from an individual with the city of Atlanta? Unless I'm wrong on this, I mean, if I'm reading it wrong, that's a question, I guess, that we're concerned that I'd like to see.
And that would be a concern. I'm not exactly sure how we would do that either, as far as policing, our medallion holders from outside and being contacted by another jurisdiction. I'm not sure how we would go about, as they are not, they're not violating our ordinance. I don't know how we would have the authority to then enforce, say Cobb County's ordinance that they're violating. I'm not sure where that would. Where we would handle that, but Mr. Bursch may be able to help on that.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Cedric Bursch. I am the manager of taxi cabs and vehicles for hire for the City of Atlanta Police Department. As far as the CPNCs, how do they work when we sell a CPNC? Approximately 1987 or 86, the City of Atlanta started selling CPNCs. And the original number was 1,600. They sold 1,600 CPNCs, and it's limited by that number for taxi cabs. And they actually have 36 CPNCs that are available for carriages or animal drawn carriages. Those original 1,600 started selling for about $100 a piece. Today, the last sale we had, they sold for right at $56,800 for one, and that allows you to operate one taxi cab.
Wow. The reason for the price, I guess, increases the demand?
It becomes a fair market value once they're out there. A gentleman from Chicago came down and visited me approximately 2 months ago. And he explained to me the same thing that happened in Chicago back when they started their CPNC process. The medallion at that time, the way he explained it to me, sold for $12,000 initially. And if you go to Chicago right now, a CPNC is approximately $400,000. In the city of New York, a CPN, or a medallion as it's called in New York, a medallion sells for approximately $980,000 to operate one taxi cab.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, so that's a one-time fee, a one-time right?
Yes, sir, to purchase it, and then they have to renew it every year.
And what's the renewal fee?
Right now, the renewal fee is $100.
So it costs $50,000 or $56,000 to buy in, if you will, the rights to participate, and then there's a $100 annual renewal?
Yes, sir, for the CPNC. Okay. Now, once I own it, I can sell it to anyone else, and that's why the price has increased, because of, again, supply and demand.
And that price is set by the seller, or this is controlled by the City of Atlanta?
This is controlled by the fair market value, what they're selling for. Basically, what happens is we are the keepers of the cost. Whenever one sells, they actually bring it through us so that we can transfer title from one person to another. And at the time that they have to provide us how much it's sold for. And so at the end of every year, I take all the CPNCs that are sold for that year, and I do a median price. And that median price becomes the fair market value.
But the proceeds go to the person that was selling it?
Absolutely. The only thing the city gets out of it is the $100 renewal.
Right. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, you have several. Is that Chairman Davis? Is that you? Chairman Davis.
First of all, I'm shocked to find out that they're selling these medallions for $50,000 for a single cab. But to the merits of the bill, what we're talking about here today, the violations and the fines, just reading the bills, line 79 and 80, and here in the substitute, says that the fine's going to be levied by the county where the occurrence happened, and that the fine, along with the documents, shall be sent to the jurisdiction where it's regulated. And later on, we had this discussion with the gentleman earlier. It said that if they're found guilty of the offense in the jurisdiction where they've done it, a hearing's going to be held there, and then that information is going to be transferred to the place where it's being regulated. So if they're not regulating something in another jurisdiction, then there's not going to be any offense. Correct?
Yes, that's the way I understand it as well, sir, is that we do have regulation. Basically, our enforcement officers write two separate types of tickets. They write a municipal ticket where it actually goes to the local court, and then we have a hearing panel made up of 3 members that's selected by the mayor, basically puts together 12 or 13 names, and then we pull from that. And at least one lawyer will be on that panel, and then they hear the cases that are brought before them, hearing panel cases, and then they assess fine amounts based on a pre-established number from the city code.
I guess my point, I had 2 points there. The point being is that the hearing's going to be held in the other county, okay? They're going to have the cost of a hearing or a judge or however they do these administrative hearings. Then they're going to levy the fine, and then they've got to transmit that fine back to the regulating body, back to, if it's the city of Atlanta. To me, this bill seems really, really complicated for something that could be handled very easily. You know, what we're after is access for people with wheelchairs to, some kind of transportation mode. So to me, it just seems kind of silly. If there's only 8 companies in the state, why we couldn't have our normal municipal and county regulation of these taxi cabs, and then for anyone that has wheelchair accessible vehicles, that we could offer a yearly license at the state to where there is no jurisdictions. It just, to me, this is overly complicated for something that, when you have so many cities and counties and combined in an area, as the gentleman stated, he's talking about going to Alpharetta and back. And he can't go to Alpharetta and back right now because of the different licensing requirements. To me, it could be handled a lot easier than what we're talking about here, because this just seems like overkill.
Chairman Reiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Davis kind of stole my thunder, because when I sit there and I look at that subsection D, and it says, the county or municipal corporation in which the vehicle for hire is regulated may at its discretion suspend. I'm sitting there going, after the hearing in another county, so I could, at hearing in another county, find you guilty, and because Mr. Keys, I think, said, because it says where occurred, and Mr. Keys says it was going to happen where the taxi was regulated. So the way this is written is, even if you've been found 10 times in jurisdiction A of this, there's no way that jurisdiction B, where it's actually regulated, may or may not suspend. Did I read that right?
You did.
I mean, I ain't got to do anything. Keep violating in Cobb all you want. Am I missing that?
No, you're not.
And you still get the fine.
And that's somewhat how we read it, and we're somewhat...
And when I heard earlier the question about, someone brought up the point about, was the word pirating? Did I remember that right? The pirating the fare? Well, if the purpose is to provide an incentive for someone to pick one up because they could, in fact, pick up someone back up, well, isn't that, in fact, pirating from another jurisdiction? Isn't that the definition of pirating?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chairman Dollar. Who's 15? Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the medallion, if a owner of the medallion want to upgrade or have another trade vehicles, does it stay with that person?
No, sir. The medallion is one medallion for one vehicle.
I understand that, but if he wants to upgrade or trade vehicles, does that medallion stay with the owner?
he says with the person,
The medallion stays with the person,
not the
Okay.
not the vehicle.
All right. My other question is, these 8 vehicles that we have that are already in the state of Georgia, do they have to pay the same amount?
I can't answer the ones that are in Savannah. The ones that are operating in Atlanta, they have CP&Cs. He paid the same amount.
How much is it in Atlanta?
56.8 was the last price.
So they have to pay the same amount for the wheelchair accessible vehicle?
Yes, sir, if
Okay.
they wanted to operate a vehicle.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question? And this is just, it really don't, I guess, really pertain to this legislation, but a medallion, if I own a medallion, can I rent it?
That's the actual CP&C process. That's what actually is happening. The owner is actually leasing it to to a company, who in turn lease it to the driver, and the driver drives the taxi cab.
So I can own it. Let's say you said a while ago they sold for $56,000 roughly.
Yes, sir.
So am I leasing that medallion per year for $56,000, or I lease it for $56,000 one time?
You actually purchase it.
I own it. I got
Yes, sir.
it. But if I've got it and I don't want to sell it, can I rent it? In other words,
that's what's
sublease. In other words,
basically that's what's happening. The person who actually owns it has it leased to a company. He leases it to the company. The company then turns around and leases it to the driver, and the driver drives that number because it's basically a number.
I think you and I are on the same track, but we're saying it differently. But
Okay.
I got it. Okay. All right. No more questions. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Mr. Tom Gill.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name's Tom Gale. I'm with the Georgia Municipal Association, and I first of all, although Senator Mullis isn't here, I'm going to praise him anyway. He's really put his heart into this and wants to try to figure out a way to get something done. But I would praise even more Representative Sheldon for her willingness to take on this issue. And you all have raised a number of questions, and when it was in the Senate, some of these similar questions were raised, but I would refer to you all to look at line 93 on page 3. I'm looking at the substitute.
Okay.
And it's my understanding that Representative Sheldon was contemplating moving this back to a sunset date of 2014, and the thought was, while there are a number of implementation questions, logistical questions, etc., the thought was that if you opened and closed a window to potentially incentivize handicapped accessible, wheelchair accessible taxis, that folks would see this as an investment, that once they have that investment, that wheelchair accessible taxi, that they're going to decide which jurisdictions after that sunset date they plan to make money in and operate in. And so because of that sunset date, we've felt like, while there are some legitimate questions, that sunset date gives us comfort that we can work through issues, and perhaps if this bill were to pass in 2014, you can come back and revisit it and maybe work through kinks if this is a model that y'all want to pursue.
John, let me ask you a question. Well, we've set the sunset provision in here to 2000, if we move it back to 2014. After that time, if it's not renewed, it'll be only grandfathering those in that currently have this handicap accessible.
Well, unless I've just got a chance to look at the
There's really not a grandfather, but I mean.
Correct. I don't read it as a grandfathering.
But how then, after that point? I mean, we've got. Let's say that we get 100, and we hope we do.
Yeah.
All right. We get 100 taxi cabs that are handicap accessible, and then after 2014, we don't allow them to go over to those other jurisdictions.
what happens if we don't? Are we giving them a special medallion for making that investment? I mean, or is that what we're trying to look at to try to?
It's my understanding that one of the hurdles is not necessarily a medallion. You could probably
just
buy one
like that. Yeah.
The hurdle is the $40-something thousand to.
Sure.
Mr. Bryant talked about $10,000 to refurbish or rebuild his vehicle. But if you buy a brand new vehicle, you're talking. I've been told $40,000. So the thought is if they understand that they can go anywhere in a metropolitan area under this legislation, they may actually buy a brand new handicapped accessible taxi, understanding that after 2 years they have to decide which jurisdictions they want to get those certificates from. That's my understanding of how it will work.
Okay. Chairman Reinders.
Now, Tom, you've come before. We've talked so many times, and Ed, I got a problem with this, and this, so we need to defeat it. And it seems to me that today it's this may be sloppy, and this may be sloppy, and this may be sloppy, but we need to pass it. We can fix it later after 2014. Is that right?
Well,
is that a mischaracterization?
That's not entirely an unfair characterization.
Okay.
I mean, I think that there are questions, and you've raised a few legitimate ones.
Thank you.
But with 8 taxi cabs in the state that have this equipment now, we don't necessarily anticipate a rush to where there'll be 100, 500 within 6 months. We may be wrong, but
Tom, I have so much respect for your intellect. That's why I'm caught a little off guard right now.
I'm flattered.
And well, I hope you will be in about 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Because now I know that when it comes to cities specifically, it's and other government entities, it's never about revenue streams. And when you've consistently heard things about jurisdictions, my mind went to, for you to support something that you said it's bad, and we can fix it later, I got to wonder if you see it as an opportunity for those jurisdictions to quickly turn around and go, now if somebody wants to come in, you can charge them. I'm trying to understand your motivation for why you're not sticking with local control on something that clearly is a little sloppy.
Well, it's my understanding.
And I love you.
Well, it's my understanding that Dawson, for instance, Mayor Albritton could potentially say, you know what, we need to
let Albany come in. So you know what, we'll just turn around and charge that little company $500, and that is that revenue stream.
Well, they could adopt a certificate of public necessity process within Dawson. They could. My guess is that,
and that wouldn't have anything to do with the way you would support it.
Well, my guess is that there aren't many folks taking taxis from Albany to go eat lunch at the China Berry Cafe, but there may be. But my guess is that if you're the mayor of Dawson, you would prefer to have somebody from Albany come and spend money in your jurisdiction, even if they took a taxi, and it may be financially detrimental. But it's a hypothetical. I just don't know.
But it's a way for them to be able to, what was that certificate you said?
Certificate of public necessity and convenience.
Yeah, it would be a way for those jurisdictions to be able to do that.
Sure, and they have that authority under current law, but many choose not to because they don't have the density, they don't have the financial, there isn't a financial ability for a taxi to make money in some.
One other point, Mr. Chairman. Tom, how do you wrap your mind around an offense happening in Cobb County in a hearing, but the regulation is in the city of Atlanta? How do you wrap your mind around that representing cities? I'm sorry, let me give Marietta instead of Cobb County.
Well, back to your point about local control. If a city of Atlanta taxi violates some provision of regulation in Cobb County, it gives the city of Atlanta discretion on whether or not to revoke that person's certificate or to fine them. And to me, it's the decision of the the jurisdiction that actually issues that certificate on what the ultimate penalty will be.
So the city of Kennesaw would be fine that the city of Atlanta imposed the fine?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I guess that is a good question. You know, would Kennesaw?
And you'd be fine with that?
Well, would Kennesaw? The question would be, would Kennesaw? I guess would they regulate or would they pull somebody over? Atlanta taxi in Kennesaw, would they pull them over and knowing that any fine or suspension may occur not in their jurisdiction but in some?
We know what they would do at the China Cafe, China Berry Cafe.
China Berry Cafe.
Thank you, Tom.
Love to eat there.
Representative Bryant.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, sitting here, the only problem areas that I see, the only problem area that I see is Atlanta. I don't see this problem existing anywhere else. And I don't know how fair this would be for us to create a situation to help a group of people when they're not going to be able to afford to use the service in Atlanta. $56,000 for a medallion, $45,000 for a vehicle, and it's not going to be used as much as a regular taxi cab, so the profit is not going to be there. In order to operate, the expenses are going to have to be high. I just don't. The only way I look at this situation is if we do something and exclude Atlanta. Savannah, we won't have this problem. I can't imagine any other city in the state having this problem.
Solar kind of gets backed up.
Okay, but I just wanted to express that because that's what I'm hearing here. You know, you're talking over $100,000 for one vehicle, and we're going to transport somebody that probably can't afford to pay over $50 or $60 a trip. And you're not using the vehicle that often, I don't believe. I know I was in the business, and I did not have that kind of business where I could pay $56,000 for a medallion and the price of the van and make a profit.
Well, I think they'll still utilize it as a regular taxi to pick up anybody.
Yeah.
But just for that specific purpose.
Yeah, but still the cost is going to be with that vehicle.
Yeah.
The same as a regular taxi.
You're right. You're absolutely right on that. Okay. Is that you, Representative Murphy? Representative Murphy.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to follow up with my colleague, Representative Bryant, and I'm not familiar with having this same situation in Augusta. Are you? Are you in a position to?
Honestly, I don't know. I guess all of this boils down to wheelchair accessible taxis, and I'm not personally aware of it, but the testimony earlier today was that there are only 8 of them in the state. So if the only way a taxi would be allowed to drive in Augusta or any other place that regulates these or doesn't regulate these taxis under somebody else's regulations would be if it is a wheelchair accessible taxi. So right now there's only 8 of them in the state, and conceivably one from Atlanta could pick up a passenger, take them to Augusta, pick somebody up and bring them back, but that may not be a realistic scenario. I mean,
but just help me with this, please. The regulation for the person that's picked up in Augusta, all of that will be controlled by the city of Atlanta. Did I misunderstand that?
They'd have to follow the provisions that are outlined in this whole new subsection, and they'd have to still comply with the rules of the jurisdiction they're taking that person to. And different jurisdictions have different rules. I mean, some say you can't smoke cigarettes in the taxi. Some say you can't play the music if the passenger asks you to turn it off. I mean, those are the kind of things that different jurisdictions will have different kinds of rules. But I'm no taxi expert. I just know that that while there are many questions about how this will be implemented, knowing that unless you're just conceivably, let's say that the number of wheelchair accessible taxis doubles in the next 2 years, then you've got a total of 16 that have this ability to go places. And I
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mr. Murphy.
Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. Will the author of the bill support removing Atlanta from this legislation?
Representative Jones, I think that Chairwoman Sheldon, we're going to get an opportunity to talk back to her in a minute, and I'll allow that question at the time. Chairman Dollar, you got a question for Mr. Tom?
Perhaps.
Okay.
Tom, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I'd like to put it out there to someone who potentially can. This may have already been answered and I just missed it. But what we've heard comments and testimony that this is not a problem in New York and in Las Vegas and in Tampa and other markets. I'm just curious as to what those states or those jurisdictions have done to incentivize this, which really this is incentivization, or have they done nothing and they're operating under a pure free market and the market has just dictated that there's enough demand here to justify this kind of investment. But that's my question.
I think it's a great question, but I don't know the answer.
I didn't think you would, but
We got somebody raising their hand. They want to answer.
I'm sorry. Most of the
Come on up to the mic, please. We're on camera. We want to make sure you get on camera.
Cedric Burst. Most of the jurisdictions, like the bigger ones, they have mandated certain percentages of their vehicles become wheelchair accessible. That's how they get around. They say, okay, 20% of the company's fleet has to be wheelchair accessible.
So in other words, they mandated.
They mandated.
Okay. All right. You have any more? You have another one? Okay. Do what? I'm going to allow Ms. Pat to come back for briefly.
Okay, I won't take long, I promise.
Okay.
What Cedric said is partially true. The percentages that are taking place right now in Philadelphia, for example, are as a consequence of litigation against the city for violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires that people who use wheelchairs have similar access as those who don't. And so there's been a great deal of litigation in all around the country around this issue of accessible taxis. And given what the City of Atlanta is doing today, we might have to have some here too, but I hope not. The fact is that how accessibility has occurred in cities all across the country is really very different. Houston, for example, a very long time ago had a wheelchair user as a vice chairman of their transit company, and so they decided that the wheelchair using public would have access a long time ago, and that was simply the decision of one person who helped to figure out a way to finance it, and so it got done. So very often that's when places are accessible, somebody decides that that's going to be that way. In Vegas, there's a city ordinance because the city fathers in Vegas knew, of course, that they wanted to be able to get every single dime out of every single customer who decided to come to Vegas. So making sure that it's accessible is an economic decision in that town. So it happens very, very differently across the country, and whatever we can do to make it happen here is what we're after.
All right, Ms. Pat, I'm going to allow one more question to you before we get ready to wrap this up. Chairman Dollar.
Thank you, and this might be a question for you or for Jeff. John, once we get into the game of, once we as a lawmaking body get into the game of mandating certain things, what then becomes the responsibility of a cab driver in terms of assisting a person in and out of the vehicle and in and out of a chair? Because I know that I've done this in the past, and I pretty much, when I move my grandmother, have to pick her up and put her in the car because she's not strong enough just with her arms to do this.
Right.
And I can tell you it's not easy.
Sure.
What becomes the legal requirement of a cab driver once we start mandating this? And then,
well, first of all, you're not mandating any assistance at all. You're mandating a vehicle.
Yeah.
And the reason it's hard for you to do what you're having to do is that your grandmother was not in a decent wheelchair that could roll into a vehicle, and therefore you had to pick her up. And so I can get in a vehicle, an accessible vehicle, all by myself, thank you very much, and so can Bill. And so that's the customer base that we're talking about, is people who are business owners, business users, people who can get in and out of a vehicle by themselves as long as the equipment is there. Do you see what I'm saying? There's no obligation on the part of MARTA drivers to touch people and help them get up and down the steps. There's no obligation whatsoever.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank
well,
you.
that's for MARTA. Now, I have no idea what other cities have done in terms of assisting passengers. I just know that in the transportation industry, that ain't what you have to do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Pat. Okay. I'm going to let Chairwoman Sheldon open it back up. And Representative Jones, I will recognize you if you want to talk to her. We're going to not take action on this legislation today. So everybody that has some concerns and all, please get with Chairwoman Sheldon and see if you can get it worked out before the next meeting. But Chairwoman Sheldon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all the testimony today, and really appreciate Senator Mullis at this point. Unfortunately, he had 3 committees to be at and wasn't able to attend this meeting. So, but I look forward to working on this legislation and perfecting it. Whenever I learned that there were only 6 cabs in Atlanta, I'm sorry, but that's a little embarrassing. And I know economics, there are definitely things in place. I applaud you guys for bringing this legislation that just basically allows, creates an incentive, but not a mandate. You know, and like you've stated very well, Pat and Bill, is, you know, these are just successful business people that are looking for an opportunity to be able to communicate, to get to work or to go to a business dinner, go see their kids, go to the mall, on their own dollar, on their own dime, without taxpayer input. So they're just, I think it's important for us to work together to simplify this. This bill may be a little complex, a complex answer to a simple answer. So let's look forward to working with you all.
Chairman Reinders has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Madam Chair, everything I've heard is the Chicagos and the New Yorks and Las Vegas. I think I heard of Nassau floated out there on me earlier. With your connection within the ARC and things of this nature, this really does seem to me, and we talked about conventions and money we lose doing this and doing that. I don't know how this plays in Tifton or Augusta or Albany. Why is it practical to ask that maybe the transportation people and the cities and the counties within the ARC get together and see if we can't work out some kind of solution?
We'll definitely do that. We'll at least make that available.
Thank you.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting meeting. Yeah.
I didn't do that on purpose.
That'd be an interesting meeting. I might like to be at that one. Any other questions for the author today? Chair, hearing none, we do appreciate everybody coming out today. We thank you for taking time to come down here, and we're adjourned.